I'm Sean DeLaney, and you're listening to What Got You There. What Got You There is a must-follow for entrepreneurs, creatives, high achievers, and change makers. Each week, I sit down with some of the world's most influential people and focus on the journey behind their success. We uncover the strategy, tactics, and routines that help them get there. Now it's your journey, so it's time to learn what's going to get you there.
What got you there with Sean DeLaney? What got you there with Sean DeLaney? What got you there with Sean DeLaney? What got you there with got you?
The reason I called it Churchill Walking with Destiny is because of the famous phrase that he came up with in his war memoirs about the day on which he was appointed Prime Minister, in which he said, I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. And I like to joke that actually all of my past life had been a preparation for writing this, the hour and the trial of writing the book, because it was a trial. But I had been put on earth to write it. I was always going to write it. He is the greatest Englishman, and I always wanted to write his biography.
Andrew Roberts is a best-selling author, historian, and journalist. He is a visiting professor at the Department of War Studies, King's College London, and also has positions at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University and the Lehrman Institute at New York Historical Society. On this episode, Andrew discusses some of the great leaders he's written about, such as Winston Churchill and Napoleon Bonaparte, and how he transitioned from a career in finance to become one of the great writers of history, and what it takes to produce great work.
Making change transpire. That's the mission behind the most amazing tasting protein bar brand taking the nutrition industry by storm. That brand, they're MCT Co, and they make the most delicious, keto-friendly, all-natural collagen protein bars. If you're obsessed with the quality of food going into your body like I am, then head out and pick up these amazing bars jammed with 10 grams of collagen protein. They only have 2 to 3 net carbs, no added sugar, and loaded with high-quality MCT oil for the healthy fats from coconuts. Whether you're busy running the kids around from activity to activity, a professional athlete, or just someone looking for a great-tasting convenience snack, do yourself a favor, head to mctco.com and use code WGYT for 20% off your order.
Andrew, welcome to What Got You There. How you doing today?
Thank you very much indeed, Sean. That's very kind of you to have me on the show.
Yes, like we were just discussing, I've been a huge fan of your work. I've loved some of the detail and new things I've learned. And we're going to dive a lot into the leaders that you've covered and yourself, but I'm really intrigued. When did you first become interested in these great leaders throughout history?
Oh, golly. As early as I can remember, my father read history at Oxford University, and so he and I were chatting about it really from a very early age of mine. When I was 6 years old, and all the other children in the class were asked what they wanted to be when they grew up, and they said things like astronaut and train driver, I told the teacher that I wanted to be Lord High Protector of England. So I was interested at least in the great man theory of history from the age of 6.
Lofty goals indeed. What was it about some of these men and great leaders throughout history that you were intrigued by?
Well, I think as a young child, you can imagine history through the lens of great men and women, can't you? It's not difficult to do. And so I suppose it was a natural assumption that that great conquerors and politicians and statesmen were people that you could identify with naturally. You didn't have to worry about all the other things that you do when you actually write history books as an adult, to do with taxation and economics and so on.
What about the intersection of this love, this fascination with historical figures, and then developing your writing process? When did you first discover that interested you a lot, where you take on this career?
Well, when I left Cambridge University, I went to work in the city as an investment banker. And I realized fairly quickly that I was completely useless at it. In fact, I was functionally enumerate. So This was in the late 80s. And so I was lucky enough to be able to chuck it and started writing history books. So it wasn't that I followed my dream straight from university. I didn't. I wasted a couple of years of my life doing something that I was really very bad at.
Were they entirely wasted years, or were there any good tips, advice, or frameworks you took
funny
on?
Funny enough, they weren't entirely wasted years, in fact, because, as I mentioned earlier, economics and finance is, of course, tremendously important in politics and statesmanship and history. And so actually, I think I probably got a bit of a grounding there that in the city that I wouldn't have otherwise. But as far as my own capacity for being a banker was concerned, it was, absolutely non-existent.
That must have been a difficult decision, I'd assume, leaving a possibly lucrative career in investment banking to pursue.
It was, especially in the 80s, it was very lucrative. And yes, I took a massive pay cut, but I've never once regretted it. It's one of those, you look back on your life, and especially if you're in your late 50s like I am, and you look at the things that you regret and the things you don't. I have not for 1 minute ever spent a second regretting leaving the city and writing history books. It's been one of the, up there with the top 3 decisions of my life.
I have to dig a little deeper there. Top 3 decisions of your life. What are the other 2 that round that out?
Oh, well, marrying my wife. and having children. I'm not going to pretend for a moment that I made some brilliant decision.
Yeah, I had to figure those might be the other 2 answers, but I had to dig a little deeper just to see.
Yeah, no, I'm not a monster. I wasn't going to.
You mentioned being able to look back and not regret it, but I would love to know what your mindset, what the narrative was like in your head when you made that decision. Take the pay cut, pursue something that's more intellectually stimulating. It's kind of uncovering your curiosity. What was that like at the time?
Scary. It really was scary. I was, a young merchant banker in the city, very nice suits. I'd just bought a open-top BMW. I was feeling very pleased with myself indeed. And then I moved to a job where I had to write a book, which took 3 years, and for which I got an advance of £1,500 to live off for 3 years. I couldn't have done it without immense generosity of my parents. And I will always thank them. I dedicated that book to them, in fact. And for me, I was just in the most tremendously fortunate position that they were generous and they believed in me. And of course, they had enough money to be able to let me pursue what turned out to be my dream, rather than being stuck in a job that I would have hated and been useless at.
You mentioned being scared. Were you viewing that, though, as a risk, or was it you had self-belief and you understood that if you pursued this, something that stimulated you intellectually, you think there'd be a reward?
It was clearly a risk, because I'd written a rubbish book. I'd thrown up this well-paid job in order to spend 3 years writing a book that no one read. As it was, actually, I don't think many people did read my first book, biography of Lord Halifax, called The Holy Fox. But that didn't really matter terribly much, because it was a great critical success. I had the most fabulous set of reviews for it, and it set me up for future books, of course, also for journalism and various other forms of making the income that I've sort of stuck with ever since.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about the time during that first book. I'm always intrigued about people's learning curve and that steep learning curve when you take on something new. What was it like writing that first book? Was it just almost a fire hose of information coming at you to understand what would result in a good book?
Yes, and I didn't know how to do it. I didn't have any friends at the time who were writing history books who I could ask about the process. So I actually literally just started going to archives with pieces of paper. This was before the word processor, and writing down longhand on 6x4 cards various quotations and where they came from and the date of them, and just building up a huge archive of my own, really, and then putting the cards in chronological order and trying to work out in my own mind what was important and what wasn't. I think I probably should have written that book in 2 years. I would today, but in those days it took at least 3 because I was making mistakes all the time. But I learned from all of them. I mean, they're not archival mistakes I've ever made again. You do learn enormously from the first thing that you do, first serious job you do in life, I think. And today I have a different process, but one that I couldn't have come to unless I'd made the errors that I had in the past.
I want to dive into that current day process here in a minute, but I would love to know the differences between your first and second book. I have to assume you vetted out some of those processes like you just alluded to, but even just the overall confidence and trust in yourself. Was there a major difference between book 1 and 2?
Yes, hugely. In book 1, I was very much tiptoeing. I didn't have any self-confidence as a writer for obvious reasons. I'd never written a book before. Or indeed anything before, apart from essays at university. And I didn't want to impose my own views too much, because what if they were shot down in the reviews? I wanted to be an enfant terrible, but there was very little opportunity to do that when you're writing your first book, I think. My second book was an awful lot more opinionated. It was much more me, really. It was highly controversial. It was attacked, and it sold many, many more copies. I think my first book, I personally met every single person who ever read that book, that biography of Lord Halifax. Whereas my second book was much more successful, made 10 times the amount of money, and was also a critical success, although it was highly criticized, if you see what I mean.
How do you deal with that criticism?
Well, luckily, I have a rhinocerine hide for criticism. No, seriously, it was, I don't know, I have a completely pachydermatous skin when it comes to people being horrible and vicious and hateful about me. I don't know where it comes from, really. It might have come from, I was involved in university politics a bit at Cambridge. And so it might have been there where people were hateful to you for long periods of time. And you just have to get used to ignoring it. And so I think that was probably the reason.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying that I'm completely, it's not that no one can ever touch me. You know, I do still tend to read reviews. And if they're unpleasant, I'm not saying it hurts at all, it doesn't, but I do make a mental note. If there's something genuine that the person's writing that is worthwhile, I will take it on board. But if it's just an attempt to be as unpleasant as possible to me, then it's water off a duck's back, and I just make a mental note to get my own back next time.
Is there a clear distinction there for you between actual valuable advice from someone and just advice that's rubbish?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And you can tell, very interestingly, you can tell within the first paragraph, really, of a review, whether or not the criticism is intended personally or whether it's constructive criticism. And if it's the latter, then of course you take it on board. You'd be insane not to. I mean, that would be an act of completely sociopathic narcissism. But if you think it's a personal and abusive attack, and I promise you I have had hundreds of those over my time as last 30 years or so as a writer, then you respond in your own personal way when you have an opportunity to, but you certainly don't let it get you down, and you never let it show, because that's the other terrible thing. There's an element of the sort of bully in the playground, that if you let it show that you've been got to, then it just encourages more of the same.
Some valuable life advice there. I'd love to know how you selected your early subjects for what you were going to write about.
I think it was serendipity, really. Not the first one. The very first one, Lord Halifax, the biography of Lord Halifax, was done solely and rather coldly, in fact, by my literary agent, my first literary agent, and I, where we sat down and looked at all the major office holders of the British government over the last 100 years and found out one who, a foreign secretary, Lord Halifax, who hadn't been written about for a very long time. And so that was, I mean, it's rather a cold-blooded way of going about it, but I do recommend it to people. You know, if there's an important person who hasn't been written about, it's extremely rare. And there might be a gap in the market, and there was in Lord Halifax's case, and so I plugged it. After that, actually, I have been, I don't know how well I come out of this. Basically, I haven't really come up with the ideas for my own books terribly much. My girlfriend has come up with one. My first wife came up with one. My publisher, my literary agent, my parents. Loads of people seem to have come up with the ideas, except for me. I think it's a little bit better now, but certainly in my early part of my life, I did tend to sort of scratch my head, and then somebody would come up with an idea, and I go, "Aha! Of course, that's what I should be doing for the next 3 years of my life."
Huh. I would have never imagined that. Just based on the breadth and the knowledge and the amount of work you put into these. So how did Churchill, Walking with Destiny? How did you decide to write that? Because I know you had written previous works on Churchill.
Yes, I'd already written 5 books with Churchill in the title or the subtitle. That was the book. In fact, there's a line about the reason I called it Churchill Walking with Destiny is because of the famous phrase that he came up with in his war memoirs about the day on which he was appointed prime minister, in which he said, I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. And I like to joke that actually all of my past life had been a preparation for writing this, the hour and the trial of writing the book, because it was a trial. But I had been put on earth to write it. I was always going to write it. It's, you know, he is the greatest Englishman, and I always wanted to write his biography, but I didn't want to do it too soon. That would have been a mistake. I think my career needed to have got to a stage where I could do it properly. And also, I didn't want to do it too late, because there's an element also of sources that become available that you've really got to grab it. Otherwise, somebody else is going to use those sources and write their book instead. So I was extremely fortunate that the time came in 2018 for me to publish that book.
Can you walk me through that balance of not being too early and not being too late? I guess I'm more intrigued about being too early. Was it about just your understanding of the subject matter, your ability to write? What was going through your head there?
Oh, lots of things. It takes 3 years to, or in this case, actually, I think 4 years for me to write a big book like Churchill. And Churchill is a big book. It's 850 pages. So I knew that it was going to need a lot of time for the research and for the writing. Although it only actually, in the end, took me 100 days to write the whole book. By that stage, I knew exactly what I was going to be doing, because I spent the previous 4 years thinking about it and working on it and researching it. That was the first thing. The second thing was just one's own maturity as a writer. If it's going to be the it sounds a very pompous thing to say, but nonetheless, if it's going to be the magnum opus of your life, if it's going to be the best book that you can possibly write, if it's going to be something that you think hope that you'll be remembered for, and that's going to be read after you die, you have to do the absolute best. You have to be at the top of your game. And I wanted to do that in my mid-50s, when I thought that intellectually maybe, but just in every other way, as far as the energy required, I start working at 4 o'clock in the morning. And that requires a certain degree of self-control that I'm not sure that I'll have in my sort of 60s and 70s. I might just be too tired for it. And so I wanted to make sure that I wrote that book, when I needed to, when I should do it. But also, as I mentioned earlier, there were sources that were becoming available. Her Majesty the Queen allowed me to be the first Churchill biographer to use her father's diaries, for example, King George VI's diaries. And he met Churchill every Tuesday of the Second World War, and he wrote down everything Churchill said, and Churchill trusted him with all of the great secrets of the Second World War. And if I wasn't the first Churchill biographer to be able to use those diaries, then somebody else would have been. And I would be kicking myself, probably for the rest of my life for not having written the book when I did.
You mentioned this was the magnum opus of your career. When you look at and hold that book, what's the emotion? What are the thoughts that come through your head?
I'm afraid the first one is a rather unattractive, inordinate sense of pride. They were 4 wonderful years. I was incredibly lucky to spend the first of them in New York, living with my wife and my children coming over, and having an absolutely fabulous apartment overlooking Central Park. And so it brings back rushes of extremely powerful memories, going off to the New York Public Library to do research, and then coming back and living in England and researching at the Churchill Archives in Cambridge, where I make a lot of friends, and an archive I love. So you get enormous sort of rabbit punches of nostalgia hitting you in the solar plexus when you pick up a book and are thinking about the writing of it. And I don't know, you also occasionally look down the acknowledgements and see the friends who you interviewed, people who knew Churchill and worked with Churchill. Few of them, not that many of them, still alive, actually. So you get sad memories as well as happy, pride-filled ones, and that's true of the acknowledgements of any of your books. They have enormous power to make you feel happy and sad and nostalgic and proud.
You mentioned the acknowledgments. I'm wondering if any of those people happen to be mentors throughout your career.
Oh, yes, several of them, absolutely. No, well, I mean, I didn't have any when I started. I just had the help of the literary agent, Andrew Loney, an extremely talented man who I knew at Cambridge University, who was my literary agent. But I didn't have anybody to sort of tell me how it was done, how you write a history book. But once Lord Halifax was published, I did meet lots of historians, and I got onto the literary party circuit in London, and very much enjoyed meeting other historians. And now many of my sounds like a terrible cliche, but many of my very best friends are historians, and I love spending time with them, and literary events and literary festivals and so on. I'm constantly meeting other historians, and as far as actual mentors concerned, there was one man in particular, a man called Kenneth Rose, who was the biographer of King George V, and a very accomplished diarist as well, it's turned out. And he guided me a bit about what you can, I suppose, first of all, the English language and how you write, but also the extent to which you have to back up all of your sources with proper endnotes and so on. It's the actual sort of mechanics of writing history. I think he was very influential after I'd written my first book.
You mentioned the guidance, and I'm always wondering about what are those guidance steps that we can learn from whoever we're having this conversation with. And you're someone who's been successful for 3+ decades now. And I'm assuming you've kind of been able to look back and assess some of the things you've done. What do you think you've done just to be able to sustain this level of excellence for so long?
Well, I like to joke that it's alimony and a mortgage. You can't if you've got alimony and a mortgage, which I've had for over 20 years, you absolutely cannot have writer's block. That is a luxury that novelists can have, but historians can't. And one of the reasons, of course, why historians tend not to get writer's block is because you can always write about what happened next, what the next day of your subject did. And so you have a straightforward thing in narrative, in chronology, that explains why you can always write the next page, and you can never have a completely blank page, because from the moment that he dies is born until the moment he dies, he's doing something, and you ought to be writing about it. So it makes it much easier, I think, for being an historian than being a novelist. On a more sort of serious and perhaps a bit more profound level, I am somebody who very much responds to deadlines. Ever since I was at university and we had essay deadlines, then certainly with journalism. I have done an enormous amount of journalism in my life. I've written for around 100, maybe more, newspapers and magazines over the last 30 years. And I have, in that time, never once delivered any copy late, and I've never delivered it either 10 words too few or 10 words too many. It has absolutely been the right length at the right time. And I find that editors, especially, they're hassled people by and large, editors, and they sometimes don't care what you've written, but they jolly well need to have the copy on time and at the right length, so they don't have to do too much editing. So to be reliable, to be utterly reliable in terms of delivering manuscripts or delivering articles, I think is tremendously important, and it's something that I respond well to, I've noticed.
Being a man who enjoys precision, I very much appreciate that. And you gave us a slight preview into your research process and even your writing process, and I know it's extensive. So I would love to start about how you go from idea, and I know you mentioned these ideas are sourced from all over the place. You never know where your next book might come from. But when you hear that idea from someone or you think it up, what are the next steps to you actually starting a book?
Well, the key one is the business one, where you go to, in this case, my agent today is Georgina Capel, who's a genius, and you talk to her about her ideas and thoughts and views, and whether it's going to work commercially, and whether or not publishers are going to like it and want to publish it. So that's a straightforward business thing, which you have to get right, and in that you have to get the right agent. And there are dozens, scores, maybe hundreds of very good writers and historians out there whose work either is not published or isn't published very well. And that's because they haven't got a good agent. And so I get asked continually, on a weekly basis by people how to get their books published. And I always say the same thing: is you've got to get a good agent. Once you've done that, of course, you start to do the broad concept. So you read, if it's a biography, you'll read the top 5 biographies of the same person, of the subject, and you'll be reading that. You'll be working out for yourself whether you agree with what they're saying, whether you disagree, whether there's a counter argument to be made. Then you go into the archives, and that's the most fun bit for a writer usually, certainly for me, where you plunge into the archives and you look at the original letters that your subject has sent and received, and really try to get under the skin of your subject, get into the mind of your subject, work out what's going on in the world of your subject at the time that he's writing or receiving the letters. And then the other great fun thing is just following your nose, serendipity again. If there's an area that you think the reader will be interested in and that you're interested in, you pursue it. And if that takes you down rabbit holes, then wonderful. And sometimes you can waste an entire week and actually it doesn't wind up in anything of it in the book at all. But never ever is that time that you regret, because it's part of the pleasure of being a writer.
I'm sure a lot of people, myself included, when you're reading those top 5 biographies or when you're in the archives, what is your process like? Are you just handwriting out notes and your thoughts and crossing out and underlining? What does that look like for you?
Well, it used to be handwritten. I wrote the whole of my biography of Lord Salisbury, which again was about 900 pages, longhand, and it was typed out later. So yes, it is so you're writing notes, you're writing things down the entire time. But now it's all on the computer. It's all on the word processor. You take that into the archive, and if a thought hits you stick it down. And then you'll find that a year later, I mean, sometimes my books last. My biography of Lord Salisbury took me 5 years to write. My biography of Napoleon took me 6 years to write. And so you'll change your mind. Obviously you will. Half a decade later, you'll think, that what an idiotic thing I wrote back in 1999. That's completely ridiculous and wrong. I've now seen so much evidence to disprove that, that I will just slice out and cut out and delete those 5 pages of thoughts that I had, because they were juvenile thoughts, which I now know to be rubbish. But you don't do that until the minute that you sit down and write the book. You have to have all of your notes first, and then you write the book. I can't understand those historians, and there are several of them, who will write sections of the book and then feed them into the rest of the book. That strikes me as just impossible, because what if you do find a piece of evidence that undermines or countermands the thing that you've already written? So it strikes me that you get all of the evidence together, and then on one day for this next book that I'm writing, it's going to be the 1st of September of this year, you wrap a cold towel around your head and start writing the book. But have to have all of the information there, and don't be surprised if you ignore 40% of it, because that was just what you were thinking about at the time.
During your research for Napoleon, I know you traveled to a large number of the battlegrounds, and I'm wondering the importance of that for you, about just understanding the photography and what is it? Why is that so essential in part of your research process?
Well, it's only essential, obviously, for a soldier, but I think if you are writing a military biography, then to not go to the battlefields is a bit like a detective not bothering to go to the scene of the crime. I mean, you absolutely have to be there. And you're right, of Napoleon's 60 battlefields, I visited 53 of them for that book. Since then, I've gone to another one. Unfortunately, the others aren't possible to see because they've all been built over. But I think it's topography is all in a battle. What the general can see from where he physically was, and where he moved to, and the way in which he understands the topography of the battle, just is so very, very important. And you see that, of course, at its most extensive, at its most dangerous, I suppose, at the Battle of Balaclava, where the charge of the Light Brigade was ordered to attack, even though the Commander-in-Chief, Lord Raglan, couldn't see the exact valley down which it was eventually to go, and that's the sort of most notorious example of it. But equally, if you go to some of the battlefields in the Peninsular War, you see why the Duke of Wellington had to ride miles and miles across battlefields in order to get a better view of what was going on. So the Battle of Salamanca being the classic example of that. But at the Battle of Waterloo, he rode something like 12 miles that day, backwards and forwards constantly, to be in the place where he was able to see what was happening and was therefore able to give the orders necessary. Precisely the same, of course, with Napoleon. And that's it's a prerequisite, I think.
Yeah, and it comes out so well in your books. I read a great number of books and biographies, and the amount of detail, the understanding of the subject matter, I'm truly in awe of it. That's why I'm diving so deep. I hope these aren't boring for you. I'm truly fascinated by this process.
No, I'm an appalling egotist. I love talking about myself, so don't worry about it.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, I'm really intrigued. You mentioned spending a few years doing the research, and then when you sit down, it's only 100 days. What is that process like? You mentioned, I think you said you start at 4 a.m. Is that how you do it every day?
Yes. I get up at between 4 and 4:30 to start work. And when I'm writing the book, and indeed for a lot of the time when I'm researching, I have obviously a sort of weird metabolism for when the actual book's being written. I use a energy drink called Red Bull, which I drink in the afternoons. I'm not sure it's very good for me, but after lunch, I'll swig down one of these things, and it'll keep me pretty hyper up until the time I go to bed. And so I can squeeze a good 16, 17 hours working in a day, more than that sometimes. And if you keep that up for 100 days and you write, as I am able to do, 5,000 words a day, you've got a good 850, 900 page book in 3 months.
Huh. The number one question I get from listeners, they always want to know about the guests we're featuring, about their routine. And you mentioned working straight after some Red Bulls for 16 hours. So what are you actually doing? You get up between 4 and 4:30. Do you just sit right down to the computer, grab your notes, and just start pounding out the book?
Well, my notes are already on the computer. They will be in chronological order. So I will know what my subject was doing. And I'm a great believer in chronology and narrative history. I don't believe people think thematically. I don't believe they live their lives thematically. You live your life from day to day, and that's true if you're Churchill or Napoleon or you or me. So I do think that it's very important also that you should never assume that your subject knows something that they couldn't possibly know because it's still in the future. And if you're going to bring your reader with you on a journey through somebody's life, the reader understands that and is perfectly relaxed with that, and actually I think is very annoyed if you treat it any other way. So I'm a true believer in narrative and context. And that makes it much easier, in fact, as a writer, because you start on the day that he's or she is born, and you end on the day they die. And so you've already got your essential structure. All you have to do is to fit in between those days all of the important things that happen to them. And you do that through having, as well as a chronology, a series of files on specific aspects of their existence. I think with my Napoleon book, I wound up with well over 400 files, and you insert those at the key moments of the narrative.
I'm not sure how frequently you're not on a deadline, but when you're not, what does your consumption of information, books, resources, things of that nature look like? Are you pretty routine with what you're consuming?
No, I'm always on a deadline. I have as I say, I thrive on them. I believe in them. I think that they, without them, I don't know what I do. But certainly over the last 30 years, there has always been either a manuscript that I've got to deliver, or an article I've got to write, or a radio or TV show that I've got to appear on, or something that concentrates my mind. On occasion, my wife and I will go on 2-week holiday somewhere, and I'll be able to read something that isn't at all connected to my work, and I find it incredibly difficult to do that. And in fact, I always carry around on me, on my person, at every all the way through, and by the side of my bed, a pad of paper that I write down ideas. There's even one in the car, if I come up with them, because I can't stop my brain working from thinking about what book I'm writing at the time. So I think my poor wife, I drag her to battlefields the whole time. It's very lucky that she enjoys history so much, because I'm constantly taking her on holidays where people have died.
Right, you're a true romantic, aren't you?
On our honeymoon, we went to the killing fields of Cambodia, as well as all the beautiful things like Angkor Wat and so on. On the day after I proposed to her, I took her to the Villa d'Este in in the Italian lakes, where Mussolini was shot.
You sure know how to set the mood.
Been on holidays to Stalingrad and Auschwitz and all sorts of places. She's a wonderful woman. I'm very lucky to have her.
Well, we're going to dive extensively here into some of your books, but I'm wondering, are there any books that you've read or just thoroughly enjoyed over the years?
Oh, of course, thousands. I mean, I review, I don't know, 50 books a year, I suppose. And please don't ask me to tell you all the books I've loved over the years. It would be like, I don't know, choosing between my children.
Yeah, I have to imagine the amount that you've consumed over the years. So I want to dive into Churchill first, and your legendary book on him, Churchill Walking with Destiny. After you finished writing that, or even during the process, I would love to know what surprised you about him you might not have known.
Golly, do you know, we mentioned earlier about the Queen's father's diaries, and I think what surprised me most about the book was how critical of the Americans Churchill was to the king. I mean, of course, he couldn't be in public. He couldn't even be to his entourage, really. He wasn't very much to his wife. But when he spoke to the king, he was able to unburden, because he saw the Second World War as a great struggle between good and evil, and between civilization and barbarism, between fascism and democracy. And for the first 2 years of the war, more than that, the Americans weren't involved, even though they were the greatest democracy in the world at that stage. And so, you know, he was frustrated. He was highly frustrated by the glacially slow movement of the Roosevelt administration towards bellicosity in the Second World War. And it shows, you know, and there, I quote several of these sort of outbursts of irritation with the Americans, at the same time, of course, that he was desperately trying to encourage the Roosevelt administration to get more involved.
Something you mentioned a little while ago was just the subtitle of the book, Walking with Destiny. And this was just some unreal belief. He truly believed that. Did you find this to be true for Napoleon as well? Did he always assume he was meant for great things?
Well, we don't have Napoleon at the age of 15, like we do with Churchill, saying there will be great struggles, great upheavals in our lives, and I shall be called upon to save London, save England, and save the empire. Winston Churchill said that when he was I think, 16-year-old schoolboy, in fact, at Harrow. And we don't have the exact equivalent for Napoleon, but there's no doubt that Napoleon believed in what he called his star, and he was going to follow his star. He spoke a lot about fortune, about destiny, providence. He used to speak of her as a woman, as did Churchill, and at the time of the first abdication in 1814, he spoke of how she, i.e., fortune, fate, destiny, had turned her back on him for the first time in his life. and spurned him, even though he had wooed her as a lover. So he had, as did Churchill, a very almost sort of psychosexual relationship with his own sense of destiny, yes.
If you were in school with Napoleon and then you fast forwarded 10, 15 years, would you just been truly astounded by the level of success? Because I could be wrong here, but did he appear to be somewhat average throughout his adolescence?
No, I don't think it's fair to say he was average. No, he's a highly intelligent lad, and you wouldn't necessarily have thought that he was going to be Emperor of France, of course, because you'd have never considered the French monarchy was going to be overthrown when you were still a schoolboy in the 1770s. However, I think you would have spotted him as someone who's going to do something remarkable. He kept himself to himself quite a lot. That can be the mark of a psychopath, but also it can be somebody who might be marked out for greatness. He was the primary reason, though, I think that you would think that he was going to go places was that he was a huge reader, a reader of history, a reader of biography. He read about the ancient world and Caesar and Alexander the Great and so on. And so in that sense, he was very clearly taking notes about how to be a great man. And so if you looked at that carefully and didn't take into account the kind of thing that children do about, sportiness or any of that kind of thing, I think you might well have noticed that Napoleon was going to be somebody special.
That was a reoccurring theme, right, amongst many of the leaders you studied, just kind of that obsession with studying history. I even know Churchill loved Napoleon and Alexander the Great. Is that something that you've seen?
Yes, I've written about this a bit in my new book, Leadership in War, because it is true. Napoleon was studied by Churchill. Margaret Thatcher studied Churchill. Napoleon studied Julius Caesar. There is a sort of apostolic succession from the. You can take it up to today. Boris Johnson has written a book about Churchill, but there are so many people. Winston Churchill himself, when crossing Westminster Hall in June 1953, at the time of the Queen's coronation, was stopped by a young American student who asked him some life advice, and he said, "Study history, study history, for therein lies all the secrets of statecraft."
That's really interesting, and I loved reading the most recent book. Just kind of the numerous different chapters on leaders throughout history. It's a quick snippet, and then you can even dive further into some of the ones you went extensively on, such as Churchill and Napoleon. Churchill, once again, I'm just so fascinated by the amount he was able to do and produce for someone that seems like they enjoyed their time in the bathtub. How was he able to put out such a tremendous amount of writing and work?
Yes, actually, he had 2 baths a day, which was hard work for his servants. For him, he was a machine. He was an absolute machine, and he was driven by the fact that his parents were great spendthrifts. That he never had very much money. He was nearly bankrupted twice in the 1930s. He was living, as he put it, mouth to hand, because he wrote for a living, and he wrote 37 books, 800 articles. He would negotiate harshly over the fees he was paid and the commissions and so on. He was a jobbing journalist and an historian, and all the better as a statesman and politician for that. Because it did mean that when he made the speeches, the great speeches of 1940 and 41 and so on, he was drawing on a lifetime of wordsmithery, there's such a word, and his capacity for literature, and it shows.
Can you speak about those speeches? Because he was able to memorize every word of hour-plus speeches, correct?
Well, he did up until 1904. But then when he was 30 years old in 1904, he lost his thread of thought in the Trade Disputes Act debate, and he had to sit down, and people worried that he had the same brain disease that had killed his father. And so after that, he actually changed his method of speaking and didn't memorize the whole thing. Instead, he drew out his thoughts on pieces of paper in what he called psalm form, because they would have the important kernel of each sentence set out and typed out. And you can go to the Churchill library the Churchill archives in Cambridge, and you can see these speeches and the way that he worked on them. And so he did use notes later on in his career, and of course it was much more important later on in his career, where every word had to count.
Yeah, we were talking about studying history as one of the reoccurring themes a lot of these leaders did, and another one seemed like their ability to compartmentalize. Is this something you saw amongst multiple leaders, just that uncanny ability?
Yes, absolutely. No, and this is something also that I go into in my Leadership in War book, because you see it again and again, the capacity of these people to be able to put everything to one side and concentrate entirely on one particular subject, and then just put that subject, as Napoleon said, in a drawer, close the drawer, and open another drawer and talk about another subject. And Napoleon used to be able to do this under the most extraordinary circumstances. A couple of examples. In the retreat from Moscow, before that happened, when he was actually in Moscow and the Russians were burning down 2/3 of Moscow, Napoleon was able to just sit down and write the rules of a girls' school that he wanted to set up in Saint-Denis, just outside Paris. And on another occasion, he was at the Battle of Borodino. As the battle was about to begin, he wrote the regulations of the Comédie Française. And this is the most incredible thing. He would whilst he's on campaign, marching from place to place, he would write to the prefect of Genoa, telling him to stop taking his mistress to the opera. It's a completely extraordinary thing. Were I to be about to fight the bloodiest battle in human history up to that point, which Borodino was, or Borodino, as of course it's known in the West, I think that would entirely encapsulate all of my thoughts and worries. But if he had an extra 5 minutes, it would be spent doing something completely different.
That is truly remarkable. And I keep bringing up these things I'm intrigued by, but I would love for you to just describe some of these recurring themes that you found, or little quirks that you're just been truly fascinated by.
Well, I think one of the things that surprised me when I was writing Leadership in War was the way in which their childhoods, or at least they weren't children, the period between about 14 to 20 was very important, and the way in which each of these leaders got an overall view of the world and the sense of themselves and their place in the world and what they were going to be able to, what they wanted to achieve. Again and again, you see this. And then also between the ages of 20 and 25, those are vital for the point at which these leaders discovered the capacity for leadership within themselves, usually by some major moment. So Napoleon was 26 when he won the Battle of Lodi and got his troops across the River Po, captured Milan. He understood that he was going to be a great man after that battle. Churchill was 25 when he escaped from the prisoner of war camp in Pretoria in the Boer War and became a international sort of celebrity, and across the empire he was admired for this daring escape. Margaret Thatcher did far better in a general election than she was expected to at the age of 24, and she found a good deal of self-confidence that came as a result of that. Stalin was, I think, 28 when he held up the state bank in Tiflis and stole the equivalent of $4 million, which made him much more respected in the Bolshevik party. Admiral Nelson sailed down the San Juan River at the age of 25 and captured a Spanish town that he held for the next 6 months. Again and again, you see it with de Gaulle, you see it with Eisenhower and General Marshall and various other people that I write about in that book, that there is a moment where they spot that they could themselves be, or indeed already were, leaders of extraordinary capacity. I'm afraid with Adolf Hitler, it was the moment where he got his Iron Cross first class at the age of 29 in the trenches. And he'd already got the Iron Cross second class, I believe. And it was, just a moment of appreciation of his own capacity for leadership. So leadership is not in and of itself a good thing. It's a bit like nuclear fission. It can be used for good as well as for harm. But it is a phenomenon that requires, I think, study.
That's what I love about your work so much. I think that you show both sides of this coin. You're not afraid to unveil some of the negative sides of leadership and success. But one thing I'm intrigued by that you were just mentioning about these defining moments, particularly from 20 to 26, does that all tie back to just developing an inner confidence amongst these people?
Yes. I mean, a combination of that and obviously the times they live in. Bringing cometh the man, cometh the hour, cometh the man, and in Margaret Thatcher's case, woman, is an obvious aspect of it as well. But yes, I think there is this key moment in their late 20s when they do something that requires leadership and brings forth their best, and they think, aha, I actually could be onto something here. I could be as great as X, Y, or Z. And it's a moment that gives them confidence, of course, but also which really does ignite the ambition. And you get this with Napoleon, who says, I think of the Battle of Lodi. Yes, it was the Battle of Lodi, where he says that you must speak to the soul. That's the way to inspire the men. And he had worked out how he could speak to the soul. And, within 10 years, he was Emperor of France.
What about when that confidence is challenged, when they experience a major setback or failure? Is there anything?
Well, yes, again, it's a key moment. And it happened in all of the cases, I think, that I write about. In fact, of the 9 people I write about in leadership in war, have 9 essays on different people. Over half of them, 5, went to jail at some stage in their lives. And Stalin, of course, exiled to Siberia as well. The way in which they dealt with setbacks, and they all had setbacks, was to treat the setback as a learning experience and as something that was not going to define their lives and their careers. So they took on board the setback in each case. And with Winston Churchill, he had 5 or 6 setbacks. He was constantly losing by-elections and so on, but making mistakes, terrible errors in his life again and again, blunder after blunder. But he learned from each of them. And in fact, the worse the blunder, the more important the lesson. You get the classic of that, of course, being the Dardanelles catastrophe of 1915 and 1916, where his decisions led directly to the killing or wounding of 147,000 people in that Gallipoli campaign. And from that, he learned never to overrule the chiefs of staff in the Second World War. So if all three of the chiefs of staff agreed on something, he did not overrule them, and that was a key factor. He had every right to, if he wanted to. He was Minister of Defence as well as Prime Minister, so constitutionally he could have, but he didn't, because he learnt the lesson of a quarter of a century earlier.
I don't know if you're someone who despises favorites, and this doesn't need to be a favorite, but I would just be intrigued who you deem the most impressive leader of everyone you've studied.
Well, I think for sheer leadership qualities, I do come back to Napoleon again and again, for reasons that are made clear at the end of the Napoleon chapter. I go through all of the various leadership qualities that he personally shows. But of course, it didn't save him. He still wound up losing the Battle of Winston and dying in exile in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean on St. Helena, the second most remote island in the world. And when you go there, you do feel it. So I'm not arguing by any means that just leadership qualities automatically are going to lead to success. Sometimes they're not.
Yeah, you mentioned the recap at the end of the chapter. It was funny in your book, Leadership in War. I was almost highlighting the entire chapter. I went back through my Kindle notes, and it was just remarkable, the number of things they've accomplished and what they've done. What about if you could spend the day with anyone throughout history? Who would you sit down with?
Churchill. Yeah, I'd want to ask him about this concept of destiny. Where he got it from, the extent to which he got it from his famous family, of course, the Churchill family, which had saved Britain in the past, the extent to which his parents imbued him with it, his schooling, his young years as an officer at Sandhurst, which of course was all about leadership. Whether or not it was something innate in himself, the writing that he read, writings that he read when he was a young subaltern. I'd love to talk to him, to interview him about that aspect, about the idea of having a star to guide yourself by. He had a star. He actually, lots of people think that they have stars, but he actually thought it was Orion, the actual star called Orion, because it helped him. Saved his life on one occasion when he got lost in the desert in the Sudan. So that's the person. If I could have a lunch, please, and dinner with Churchill, with me being able to do a lot of the actual questioning and him being entirely honest in his answers, and not a sort of politician dealing with an interview, but somebody who had all his marbles at the end of his life, nothing to lose, nothing to gain by it except for the pleasure of conversation. It's something I'd right now give my little finger to be able to do that.
Yeah, you'd have to set up two baths right next to each other. You guys could just go on for hours discussing. I would love to hear that conversation. Unfortunately, I know we won't be able to do that. I just have a few more quick ones here for you. I know you're a tremendous collector of artifacts and memorabilia. Your office is the breadth of memorabilia across your office is incredible. I would love to know if you could have one piece of memorabilia, what would it be?
Well, I'd probably, I do think about this because we all think about what would happen if our house burned down and what you grab. And everybody goes, oh, it'll be the photo albums of the children when they were small. What rubbish. I'm not going to do that. I've warned my children that I'm not going to do that. And anyway, nowadays these things are all digitized. No way am I going to grab photo albums. I'm going to grab Winston Churchill's bow tie, which I bought at auction a few years ago, and which gives me immense pleasure every time I look at it. And it's the thing that I will save after the wife and children.
Yeah, I know there's a video online of you showing that piece and going through some of the other pieces throughout your office. What about it?
Oh dear, that's a disaster to do that. I shouldn't have done that. That's just an invitation to burglars, frankly, isn't it?
well, hopefully you have a good.
They're quite difficult
system.
to fence. I mean, quite difficult to say Winston Churchill's bow tie, I think.
What about something that you don't possess? Is there something out there that you know has lasted?
Yes.
What is that?
Yes, there is. Oh, I'd be insane to tell you, because one of your listeners will then go and buy it. There's no way would I tell you that. I've got my eye on it. I've had my eye on it now for 5 years. I am still saving up. I'd like to pretend that being a author was the key to riches. It certainly isn't. It's a key to having a fascinating and rather lovely life and career, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can buy this historical artifact that I one day will get. But unfortunately, at the moment, it's just that little bit out of my reach.
Fair enough. So as we wrap up here,
invite me on again in a couple of years' time. Tell you whether or not I've managed to snaffle it. You never know, especially with the world economy going into free fall at the moment. There might be a chance just to do a Danny deal, as we call it in England.
Luck and timing can be a hell of a thing. It might be on your side here. So we'll wrap up here. You've studied all of these tremendous men and women, these great leaders. What have you changed the most personally, do you think, after studying some of these people?
Oh, golly, what a very deep psychological question to ask. Sorry, what in me has changed as a result?
Correct, yep.
Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh. Do you know, I don't know, you've got to ask somebody else that. You've got to ask my wife that, or somebody who knows me. I don't think I've changed hugely since I was 20 years old. I still have the same interests. I mean, I wouldn't mind being Lord Protector of England, by the way. So I don't suppose I've actually changed since I was 6 years old. But no, seriously, I suppose ultimately I know now, in a way that I didn't when I was starting writing, that it's a job for life. It's something that I totally love doing. I wouldn't consider doing anything else. There was, I have in the past had other ambitions, and I'm so pleased that I never went down the paths of any of them except for being an historian, because there are 3 separate bits of it. The research bit, which I love doing. The writing bit, which I hate, but I realize needs to be done. There's no other way. And then the publicizing bit, what we're doing now, chatting to one another, and the travel all around the world. My books have been translated into 22 languages. So I get to go around the world and talk to people who are interested in history, and get paid to do it. So in a way, it's the dream job. And I realize more and more that it's the one that I was put on earth to do.
Well, I'm so thankful that you turned down that potentially lucrative investment banking career, because I truly mean it. I love your work. I think it's remarkable. The last 6 weeks, it's fun. I almost feel like I've spent time with you, because I got to go back, reread Churchill, Walking with Destiny, Napoleon, A Life, and then your latest book, Leadership in War, Essential Lessons from Those Who Made History. So I really do appreciate your work. This has been incredibly entertaining, thought-provoking, and I'm just so appreciative of you and your work. So thank you for joining us on What Got You There.
Thank you so much for having me on. I've really enjoyed it, Sean.
We're going to have everything linked up, books, your social handles, things of that nature. Anywhere else or anything you want to direct the listeners to?
No, I think we've really covered it. I mean, it's been a hell of a journey.
Well, fantastic. Well, we'll have to schedule a time in a few years here to get you on for round 2 and be celebrating.
Yes, I can tell you about. Yeah.
Well, thanks again for joining us on What Got You There.
You are kind. Thanks a lot, Sean. I appreciate that.
You guys made it to the end of another episode of What Got You There. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I really do appreciate you taking the time to listen all the way through. If you found value in this, the best way you can support the show is giving us a review, rating it, sharing it with your friends, and also sharing on social. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Looking forward to you guys listening to another episode.